Good morning. I hope all of you can hear me.
We can.
Okay, so I'm going to speak about water services provision and look specifically at emergency public procurement and then what we can do to prevent corruption during these processes. Emergency public procurement is an essential enabling tool for government to mobilize resources necessary to provide basic water services in emergency situations. As such, emergency public procurement therefore plays a strategic role in realizing the Sustainable Development Goals 3, 6, 11.5 and 13.1, which involves providing clean water while reducing the impact of disasters and strengthening resilience against such disasters in cities. The South African president declared a national state of emergency in response to the COVID pandemic on 15 March 2020. This strategic decision enabled the government to inter alia follow special procurement processes to respond better to the COVID outbreak. Often in these cases of emergencies, financial controls are reduced and additional funds are made available to increase the responsiveness of governments. In addition, governments are put under immense pressure for immediate action in states of emergency such as COVID. These lax financial controls, seeming new abundance in finances, and increased pressure creates a fertile breeding ground for corruption, a potentially huge obstacle for the realization of SDG 16, which refers to strong government institutions. The COVID-19 pandemic also turned the spotlight to the importance of access to water and sanitation and hygiene in South Africa. Many communities in South Africa at the time did not have adequate access to basic water services, and therefore emergency procurement had to be undertaken to secure access to water. According to Independent Online, about 600 million rand was spent on water tanks for schools, and also that this procurement is under investigation by the Special Investigations Unit for alleged corruption. JoJo tanks were also procured and meant to be installed in informal settlements. However, more than 30% of these tanks have yet to be installed or accounted for. And this is where my research project fits in. I was interested to investigate if emergency procurement processes are effective in preventing corruption while still being responsive to emergency situations. I therefore did not look at the entire supply chain management in emergencies, which would include, for instance, contract management as well. More specifically, I looked at tender type procurement and at emergency water services and infrastructure. For example, the water tankers sent to informal settlements and the water tanks that were provided for schools, and not so much at bulk water services provision. I looked specifically at the tender procurement method because the provision of water services often means that local government is looking to spend more than 200,000 Rand for one contract, and any contract above this amount must follow a competitive bidding process. This type of procurement provides for a time-consuming two-stage bidding process where a public invitation for tenders is advertised and potential suppliers are invited to submit detailed technical and cost proposals by a specific date. This is then followed by a more burdensome procedural requirements which dictate how tenders are selected, evaluated, and administered. Now, in emergency situations, these procedures are impractical regardless of the value of the contract proposed. Emergency circumstances in this instance can be understood as serious, unexpected, and potentially life-threatening circumstances, including the event of an immediate threat to the environment or human safety, which require immediate rectification. These circumstances therefore require immediate action to avoid interruption to critical services or to avoid dangerous and high-risk situations. Now, from this definition alone, we can see that you cannot follow this two-stage bidding process and all its requirements. With COVID, for instance, the immediate action required in South Africa was to increase hygiene, which involved improved access to water. It is thus that legislation make provision for exceptions to procurement prescriptions. These prescriptions are found in the MFMA and the Disaster Management Act and allow for organs of state to deviate from the two-stage bidding process. An organ of state may dispense with the invitation of bids and can obtain only quotations by using the list of prospective service providers. This does away with the formulating and distributing of invitations and other cumbersome requirements associated with the two-stage bidding process. However, the nature of the emergency and the details of the justifiable procurement process followed must still be recorded and reported to the Director of Supply Chain Management. The reasons for dispensing with competitive bids should be clearly recorded and approved by the program manager concerned or authorized person or his or her delegate. The emergency should be further certified telephonically or in writing by the manager of the user division. Dispensing of the requirement to follow a two-stage bidding process therefore saves valuable time in emergencies and allows municipalities to be more responsive. So, risk areas in emergency procurement have been identified by scholars, and some of them include the misuse of legitimate deviations from the rules, discretionary powers which may often be abused, the misuse of confidential information. For instance, firms may offer bribes to gain confidential information regarding available budgets and may overprice their goods and services as a result, and political and diplomatic pressure, which can influence procurement decisions to push a political agenda instead of actually responding to the emergency situation. Now, some anti-corruption measures are already in place in our law to address these risk areas, and they may include a procurement legislative framework, which is aimed at the procurement complying with the 5 constitutional principles, namely fairness, equity, transparency, competitiveness, and cost effectiveness. This framework is also further aimed at the responsible use of public resources. The MFMA, as part of this framework, gives the municipality the authority to hold political office bearers and municipal officials liable for any unauthorized, irregular, fruitless, and wasteful expenditure, and to recover such losses caused to the municipality as a result. The Public Audit Amendment Act, in addition, empowers the Auditor General to investigate any material irregularities and may dictate that remedial action must be taken by the municipality to ensure that resources are procured economically and utilized effectively and efficiently. In addition, some actions which may take place in procurement are listed in the MFMA and the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act as offences punishable by imprisonment. These actions may include partaking deliberately in corrupt activities or in a gross negligent manner fail to prevent corrupt activities such as bribing. Now, according to the Supply Chain Management Circular on urgent and emergency procurement of goods and services and the Municipal Supply Chain Management Regulations, supply chain management policies, which should be adopted by each municipality, must empower the accounting officer to take all reasonable steps to prevent any abuse of the procurement system, and to empower them further to investigate any allegations of fraud, corruption, favoritism, etc. Local government, in addition, is expected to exercise due diligence in emergency procurement. This includes the duty to review National Treasury's database prior to the awarding of any contracts to ensure that no recommended bidder or any of its directors is listed as a person prohibited from doing business with the state. The Municipal Supply Chain Management Regulations also makes provision for the prohibition from certain people participating in procurement, the rejection of certain bids, and cancellation of contracts in particular circumstances. In addition, the notes to the annual financial statements of a municipality must disclose particulars of any award of more than 2,000 Rand to a person who is a spouse, child, or parent of a person in the service of the state. However, experiences of emergency procurement involving specifically the procurement of water tankers to informal settlements and water tanks for schools during the COVID pandemic has shown that corruption may still have taken place despite these measures that are already in place to combat corruption. So what can we do then to improve our corruption preventative measures and still keep emergency procurement system responsive? Now, scholarship has made some suggestions. Some of the community's emergency needs can be anticipated by organizing advanced procurement instead of obtaining it through emergency procurement processes when the emergency situations present itself. As an example, now in South Africa, in case of emergency water services, this could have been well anticipated if communities and schools had adequate access to water services in the first place. The need for emergency water services would then have been minuscule. Transparency can be increased if legislative measures are employed to coerce the publication of information relating to procurement proceedings and to allow the community to observe the adjudication process of all procurement. Some common templates for sharing information could also be developed for suppliers. And while experienced procurement personnel will compare purchases informally with each other, information should also be formally coordinated at a sectoral or centralized level. Local government can also facilitate better community participation in the selection and monitoring of goods and services. And as far as feasible, beneficiaries should be informed about procurement processes and provide input to these procurement decisions. In this regard, the government was heavily critiqued for the late publication of the list of awarded COVID-related contracts. And if you look at this list is also difficult to decipher, which completely then makes the requirement of transparency obsolete. Real-time evaluations could also be used to monitor emergency procurement processes. Now, as the name suggests, it involves a rapid interactive peer review, and real-time evaluations can be a useful tool which can identify and correct problems in procurement with little time lapse between actions taken and the evaluations. When auditing and monitoring emergency procurement processes, focus should be on the outcomes, and therefore less emphasis should be placed on the procedural requirements and ticking the boxes than the actual outcome of the contract. And this may be a particular effective measure against so-called legitimate corruption. Government should also admit that the media and NGOs play a very important watchdog function when it comes to exposing corruption in procurement, and should therefore give more credit to the work that these institutions do. But then they also have to have the proper investigative capacity to investigate those allegations which are credible, which these organizations show us. So from this, we can see that there is some measures available which we can implement within our existing legislative framework. And these measures rather call to a change in the professional ethos and practice and better implementation than more regulation. And that is all from my side. Thank you for listening to this presentation.